So I just want to make sure. All right, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be working again with the Alliance for Innovation. I've just found that the conversations that I have with people that are attracted to this organization are just creative and smart, and also represent that spirit of public service that so many people in local government do. Very excited today to play a sort of a moderating role to help draw out some of the most important lessons and ideas and creativity of two fantastic cities, City of Greensboro and City of Wauwatosa. And we've got representatives from each of those who will talk a little bit about what we're doing. I want to start by just giving a little bit of context. It's not like the ARP needs that much context anymore, because at least for a lot of local governments, it has been I'll let you decide if it's transformative, but it's been a major benefit this year, especially compared to last year, in particular for those entities that were hard hit by COVID, especially those that rely on a sales tax. So it's really been a fantastic opportunity. So just by way of kind of opening this up, I'm going to share my screen, and I've just got 4 slides that I want to share. Oops, let's see, there we are. Okay. And so, in terms of looking at this opportunity, there's a question, why should you do public engagement? And actually, Sarah and Melissa have great answers for that. So I'm not even going to try to, but they've got really compelling answers. But I mean, the first reason is that the U.S. government, the one who is allocating this money, really wants you to do it. So this is guidance from Treasury Department, where they're just urging you to involve your communities in doing this. The next one is closer to home. And that is that your elected officials have taken a greater interest in the last year in budget than I've seen ever. It's been really interesting in the last year. So my company, Balancing Act, we sort of specialize in budget engagement and budget simulations. And we have seen this market increase. Last year, it was largely due to negative factors, that a lot of entities were cutting significantly from their budget, and there was a lot of pain. And so local officials, public elected officials really got involved in helping to structure that conversation about what would be the wisest course of action. Now, for many of you, we're looking a little bit at the flip side. We're looking at, well, gosh, we've got this tremendous opportunity, what one of Melissa's colleagues called a once-in-a-career opportunity, the finance director at Wauwatosa, to do something really interesting here, to do something potentially transformative. And so a lot of both elected officials as well as other public administrators are seeing this as a tremendous opportunity. And it's also a very visible one, because the stimulus has gotten so much attention. Probably some of you have seen headlines in your local media that says, X city has such and such millions of dollars. And on one hand, that's a good thing, but on the other thing, there's both an obligation there. There's also a risk that people will think that all is fine, that all needs can be satisfied, and that and the need to message that, yes, it may be a lot of money, but it's one-time money. And so finding a way to structure that conversation and involving your elected officials so that it can be a productive one. The other thing, there's 2 more things that are less tied to the ARP, but I think are probably fundamentally even more important, is just to think about, what is that role and that relationship of a local government and residents. So I was mentioning before, if any of you were on early, we were kind of talking about this conference that I presented at yesterday, that was about the Budget Act of 1921, which was a seminal act in the federal government, and it kind of transformed the way that the federal government did budgeting. But one of the takeaways, or one of the reasons why the conference existed yesterday, was to talk about new opportunities for residents to be involved and finding that appropriate place. I mean, that's really the key, is what is the appropriate place for residents to participate and provide input on budget decisions, whether or not it's for something like stimulus or even the ongoing budget. And so I just love this quote. This is from Jane Kavanaugh and Vincent Raitano in their book, Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities. It's published by GFOA. And they're really recommending institutionalizing budget engagement. So it's not something that you just did last year when there was a lot of pain in a lot of places. And it's not something you just do this year when a lot of you are looking at a significant benefit and opportunity, but it's something that's just in the core of how you do business. And I will say, and there's another article in GFOA in the Government Finance Review that talks about how technology has dramatically changed budgeting, but it's really dramatically changed the quality and the opportunity for which you can engage residents. You can sort of, engage them in a productive conversation, not make them budgeters, but say, there's 5 or 8 things that that would really be useful to the city government to have input from you on as we move forward, and we'd like to get your informed input. And then the last thing is sort of my distilled wisdom of doing this for about 15 years. And we try to keep it a little bit catchy. So we call them, these are the 3 C's, the 3 C's of budget engagement. And that is that if you can do these 3 things, we think that you'll be far along in terms of having an effective process. And so the first one is to convey constraints. So the most obvious constraint is you can't spend more money than you have, right? So that's sort of obvious. When you're talking about stimulus funds, there's also other constraints, such as you can only spend this money on certain things. I mean, fortunately, that's hasn't been too big of an issue with the ARP funds, but it's still something to keep in mind. And in other types of budget engagement, like in the general fund, you need to do that. Second one is context. And I can't stress enough. We actually just had there's in this year, this current issue of the Journal of Public Administration, there's an article that reports on using our budget simulation with a scientifically representative sample, looking at what was a protective factor for various items, spending items that government spent money on. And what they found was that when you provide context, that's a protective factor. That when people understand what government is doing, they tend to support it, or at least in this case, because they're presenting an established budget, they're less likely to want to cut it. So when you're doing budget engagement, you need to explain, give people the opportunity to learn what an item is. Why is it there? It's highly unlikely that it's there for some crazy, inexplicable reason. So provide some explanation. And then the third one is consequence. So you often hear, I've heard people say, oh, I could balance that budget in 5 minutes, and they just take a red pencil to it, right? Well, it's not that easy, obviously. I mean, all of us know that, but to share those consequences. So for example, if somebody says, yeah, well, okay, let's balance the budget by cutting back on libraries. Well, that's not a free cut, right? I mean, it means that maybe libraries won't be open on Sundays anymore. Maybe they'll close earlier in the evening. And so, to kind of keep that in mind, to educate people about what those consequences are, is a really powerful thing and important thing in terms of budget engagement. So those are sort of my framing comments, Brandy. Did you want to introduce the other 2, or what do you think is next?
Yeah, yeah, Chris, I think let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and jump in.
Okay, so Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, this is so I'll just tell you, I'll give you the view behind the curtain here. We had a planning call, and we kind of thought this would be like, 10 minutes for me, 10 minutes for Sarah, 10 minutes for Melissa. And when we got Sarah and Melissa on a Zoom call together, they just built off each other and interacted with each other, and were just fantastic. So we decided to change this, and I'm actually going to kind of step back a little bit. I might throw in a question or 2, and John Johnson from the Alliance for Innovation might throw in a question or 2. He's a very experienced budgeter in public finance. But really, what they're doing has just been so inspiring to me that we're going to just kind of let them go a little bit. So I'm going to just give a little light structure at the start, which is just to ask each of them if they'll spend about 2 or 3 minutes just telling us, the kind of the current status. What are you doing right now? What are you thinking? And kind of which direction are you headed? And then we've got a sort of a series of questions after that. But obviously, you guys were fantastic on that planning call. So I'd say just go for it. So Sarah, you want to go first?
Well, now that you've set that bar nice and high for us.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm Sarah Hancock. I'm a budget and management analyst with the city of Greensboro. I have been with the city for about 5 years, but I did have a 2-year break in the town of Chapel Hill. So, since I've got my MPA, my experience has been in the budget field here in North Carolina. To tell you a little bit about how we have begun to approach this. Obviously, these funds came into we realized we had them right around the same time that we were having budget discussions. So as many of you probably encountered, we had a lot of conversations initially that were the council trying to figure out what buckets they wanted to use and how they were going to approach this windfall of money, which we've never experienced and very likely, we'll never experience again. So this really is a once in a career sort of encounter. We don't anticipate having something like this happen again. And so our community leaders were really trying to figure out how they could approach this thoughtfully and long-term, and how they could make sure that it had the most long-lasting impact, but also address some of those very direct consequences of a pandemic. So what we were able to do with my office, with our city management and the council, were to come up with the concept of having a community outreach period, which we have not put any time constraints around, but rather we opened up a simulation using Balancing Act to allow the community to really interact with us. And the simulation has been now up since May 25th. And it basically allowed us to think about what our community strategies were. So for us, we were thinking about those one-time, you're never going to do them again purchases like broadband infrastructure or making repairs or anything like that, water and sewer investments. What types of support for the community programs would be, like nonprofits, small businesses, and those more ongoing, but very directly tied to the community, affordable housing. And then we also had the revenue replacement, factor. A lot of us lost revenue. So, what was the community's thoughts about replacing those revenues and trying to help them understand what that means? So we used the simulator and kind of created those 3 buckets and had the community begin to give us feedback. And I would have to tell you, comparatively to what we typically get with our budget engagement, which we do use Balancing Act as a part of our infrastructure for community engagement every year. And we have, I believe, for 5 or 6 years now. What we found was that we got insane engagement. We have over 500 responses, 2,700 page views, and a lot of comments, enough comments that I'm actually putting together like an affinity chart to try to understand and bubble them together into concepts. So we've had a really overwhelming response. We've also had overwhelming response from the media who wants to come in and have conversations with us. So that high visibility has been fantastic. And it's really starting that conversation, and starting to figure out how we report this out to our leaders. So that's been really encouraging and exciting because we don't typically get that kind of engagement when it comes to the dollars. People don't always understand it. So I think they kind of shy away from it. And this is, to Chris's point, has been so visible from the very beginning that it's got people interested. So I think there's also that opportunity to get people excited about transparency and to make them feel involved in the process and then actually see that come to fruition. They aren't just asked, but they actually see the fruits of that labor and that input that they provide. So I'll pass it along to Melissa now so she can talk a little bit about what they're doing, but that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, and Sarah, I was just going to say quickly, if you have it up, if you can share your screen, let's go to Melissa first, but if you, at some point, if you could sort of walk people through so they can have a visual, I think that'd be fantastic.
Sure.
But Melissa, that'd be great. And Melissa, why don't we turn to you now? And you're sort of in a different place in this in terms of your process and your planning, which, but it really captured my attention. Even your RFP, read as a morally compelling document. So tell us what you're up to in Wauwatosa.
So hello, everyone. Melissa Contreras-Weiss. I am in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, which is a neighboring suburb to the city of Milwaukee. And I am the Director of Administrative Services here for the city, and I do lead our community engagement functions. We have just received responses to an RFP that we let for engagement to help us determine how to best spend our ARP funds. We are a community of 47,000 residents at night, and we grow that population pretty close to 70,000 during the day. And we knew, as Sarah said, and as Chris have said, this is really a once in a career opportunity for us. And we could absolutely kind of take that easy path, hit that easy button, fund projects already determined in our capital improvement program. We certainly have a lot of projects in there that could be cash funded through this project and through these funds, but we really want to be intentional about talking with our community, engaging with our residents, and considering what types of impacts from COVID might be a little bit underneath the surface that we're not seeing at first glance, and taking these opportunities to really transform the community, build resilience in how we're expending these dollars. And so we are bringing on board a consultant to help us with a community engagement program. It is very similar to the 3 C's that Chris was talking about, because of course we do need to provide a lot of context to the community and some guide rails about here are things that are eligible for these expenditures and here's what's not. Here's what makes sense And here's what doesn't make sense. For example, we don't want to build in ongoing operating costs into our budget, and do things like that, as I'm sure you're all experiencing as well. But this is really an opportunity for us to engage and educate as well. And so we're looking at that very carefully. Our consultant is going to have a series of public engagements and open houses and virtual engagements with the community to first set about 5 to 7 themes of what we should be focused on for spending these money. And then through a process internally with our staff and externally with the public, we're going to ideate, as we're calling it, different innovations and ideas for what we might spend the money on, and partner people in the public with really innovative ideas with a staff member to help them figure out how to flesh it out and how to make it work. We will take those projects through a ranking program and procedure with the public and our elected officials, and ultimately come up with our plan for what to spend money on in partnership with the community, and kind of embracing that public servant heart that we really have here in Wauwatosa to talk and engage with our residents, our business community, and be really thinking about the future here for what we should do.
Yeah. And Sarah, I'm just wondering, this idea of transformational has been, sort of thrown around, and on our planning call, we talked a little bit about how the per person or per resident amount that Wauwatosa is actually significantly larger than what Greensboro is getting. And I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, local government has far, far too many needs right now than it can pay for. But how are you all seeing this? Is this something that is potentially transformational, or is it moving along important, capital projects? Or how are you balancing that? How do you guys see that? Is this transformational, or is it, just maybe a little bit of a breathing room for you?
Absolutely. I think, well, it's a little bit of both. So, there is that breathing room. There were definitely some funds that we went ahead and allocated to just balance the budget. It wasn't significant, but it was enough to make sure that we had, that one-time little boost to get us through the next year and see what our sales tax numbers were, and really explore the different programs that we had and make sure we were properly prioritizing. This has actually kicked off for us a performance measurement and prioritization kind of task that we're going to try to go down that road and understand how we're actually prioritizing our dollars at the department level. But from a larger perspective, I think that what it has brought to the surface is those one-time dollars give us opportunities for affordable housing. I mean, that is a huge issue across the country right now. And I know I had mentioned on our planning call, Greensboro has a 8 to 10 day housing stock. So, that's significantly low. If something goes on the market or something is available for rent and that it is that quickly off the market, it's very difficult for people to find affordable places to live. And so that's one focus that's been a huge feedback point for us and our initial results from the public. And just pulling up my report here, right now, 30% of our respondents have rated that as the highest priority. So that's, when you take into account 5 different areas, I mean, for them to say like, this is really what we need, that has to be taken into consideration, because that doesn't just impact right now, that impacts way down the road. And Melissa had mentioned in our previous call as well, we don't know what the impacts of COVID are yet either. This isn't really over, as much as we like to think that we're on the upswing. There's still a lot of unpredictability and a lot of long-term impacts we don't know about yet. So things like housing and broadband, water and sewer investments, and these one-time transformational things that aren't as sexy necessarily as, like a big cool mural or, fancy sidewalks or something like that. Those are great projects, but the long-term implications of investing in things that will help us prepare for the future, but also the possible next pandemic or next, crisis situation or emergency situation, those are what will be transformational for us. So that's what we've seen, is that people are calling upon those one-time investments because they see the value in that moving forward. They see the value in that, in feeling secure that if something were to happen again, we're investing in the future, not just the right now.
That's great. Melissa, what does that stimulate for you? And I'll just throw in one little item that if you wanted to comment on. Your finance director, John Regini, has, when I talked to him initially, he said that he personally feels a special obligation to involve young people in this planning, because he said, after all, this is borrowed money and they're going to pay it back. So how are you seeing this as transformational and intergenerational, and how are you involving young people, and how do you think the benefits ought to be divided in terms of what you spend the money on? How are you looking at that?
I think generational impacts are just so important, and it's something that at times we in our budgets don't talk about quite as much, but that impact of how much money are you borrowing to pay for your infrastructure, that is a bill that our children and grandchildren will someday pay. And so we really do want to be intentional and think about that. How do we engage with young people in the community? Well, I think part of it is where you're talking to folks, right? So you got to get onto the right social media. You need to get out and about in the community at the right events to talk with folks. We also have a youth commission here in Wauwatosa that's very active. And so we'll be engaging with that group for additional outreach, but also partnering with our school district to hear what those needs are. And when we really think about the impacts of COVID-19, I think every community has probably experienced mental health impacts across the board, but certainly for our youth who have had a year hiatus of remote, of no sports, of no socializing, remote school. And in some communities, that remote school looked really different depending on if there is internet access, if they had the connectivity through virtual platforms that was effective or not. And so one of the areas we are going to really dive into with this community is exploring what were the mental health impacts coming out of COVID for youth in Wauwatosa, and what type of programming through our health department and through our school district should we be setting up to address that. And so that really, I think we have an obligation as local government leaders to be thinking about those things and how we can use these funds for those impacts. The other thing that I kind of spur off of with what Sarah said is we're also really thinking about resiliency and building resiliency for this community. I think we all hope we don't have another pandemic of this nature to address and emergency manage in our lifetime. But what are the other things that our community might face kind of coming out of this? And so part of economic development resiliency for us is thinking about how do we help our small business community stand up more of their online platforms, more of their websites and online shopping carts, so that they are pandemic proof, so that they are Amazon proof, because we all have those competitions, but our main streets and our communities are critically important. And I know we have a lot of small businesses that drive our tourism economy and our local economy here that maybe need some assistance and expertise in thinking about those things. And so we're carefully considering how we could bring in some experts to work with them individually to set them up for a resilient future.
Wow, that's fascinating. Sarah, what does that raise for you?
I love that she pointed out that this idea that we do need to be resilient and ready to be able to pivot onto an online environment in the event, or just to keep up in general. I mean, whether we're prepared or not, Amazon really has changed the scope of how we shop, and also how our kids are learning is changing. I think that we are going to continue to see more of a hybrid approach in the school systems, much like we are seeing in the workplace, where people are going to be going to need more access. So that's for me, it makes me think about this broadband conversation that is happening across the country. Here in Guilford County, we do have some rural areas outside of Greensboro, but for the most part, it is pretty accessible to get internet. That said, it's not accessible for everybody. It's not affordable for everybody. And so one of the considerations that has been brought up, something that's been brought up in the simulator, is making sure that we have access at all of our rec centers, all of our libraries, for Wi-Fi, for somebody to get on and be able to log in and do their schoolwork, accessing high-speed internet so that they're not going to fall behind, so that they can make sure that they're engaging with whatever learning platform that they're utilizing. But then also just having infrastructure downtown with downtown Wi-Fi. That's, you know, we used to have it. I think it was an experimental, it was before my time, an experimental thing. And, you know, that we need to kind of be thinking about how do we put those in position, those type of one-time kind of gems into place. And then, you know, to Melissa's point, see that change how our community interacts in the future and how that can help create spaces for people that they otherwise wouldn't have. And I had another thought, but it has left me, so I'm going to pivot for a second. And if you would like me to show this
Yeah, I would.
later, I'm happy to just pop this up here.
Yeah, if you would, and while you're doing that, I'll just say that I think, you know, I think local governments are often a little bit maybe ambivalent about doing budget engagement, whether it's for stimulus or for general budget. In some ways, it's because they don't know what the public knows, what the public wants to know, how they want to interact. And I think that we're finding, especially with technology, that you can do a lot more than you could a few years ago. But I think one of the really important things to think about is that as the professional staff, especially, you have the ability to frame a conversation. And so I want to have Melissa talk a little bit more about resilience, and Sarah talk a little bit more about resilience. Like, how do you frame a conversation about resilience, and why are the public parties in that, as opposed to just an expert, a resiliency expert? You can hire a consultant. I mean, you can Google it or something like that. But what I've found is the real power for, especially for the professional staff in a local government, is to frame the right kind of conversation. And a simulation or a process like Melissa's talking about is a powerful way of doing that. So Sarah, show us what you guys have been doing at Greensboro.
Yeah. Can you see this Greensboro page right here? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, you know, we had to do this on the fly. So I do want to be transparent here that there was not some long-term planning process. This was, okay, they want input, they want to start having these discussions, but they don't want to have them in a vacuum. And by they, I mean our leadership and city council. So we very quickly got some language together, got a page on our city council's page here. And you kind of gave them the basics, right? How much we're getting. We actually did just find out that this funds must be spent by 2024. We're about to update that language because we did receive that it had to be obligated by 2024. So that's changed a little bit. The interim rule has been making us all interim final rule has given us all a good giggle. And then also kind of pointing out here, like, we can't spend things on tax rate reduction. That does not stop people from asking for it, but trying to give them some high level parameters about the spending. And then I'm just going to click in here. So we have a link directly to our simulator here. We do ask if they're a resident, but we do not stop somebody from giving us input. I'm just scrubbing those out and keeping that data off to the side right now because the interest really is in the residential data. But we have the setup of how many recovery dollars we have. You know, as I said, we received 59.4 or anticipate to receive that much. And we do have our spending categories set up into those three areas that I had described earlier, right? So community programs is one focus area for us. And to back up just a little bit, these three areas align with our strategic plan and how our city has expressed wanting to spend funds. And what areas we like to target. So this does align with a larger, you know, set of goals that the city council and the city manager's office have identified. So in here you can see we did some very broad topic areas just to get ideas, you know, nonprofits, small businesses, other impacted industries, and we're allowing people to add comments, and they are not being shy, which is fantastic. People are giving us commentary and telling us specifics. They are saying, nonprofits that support homelessness, that has increased. Nonprofits that help support mental health efforts. I mean, people are telling us very specific. You know, the dollar amount is less important here. It's fun for them, but it's really to get them to think about what those, what it really means to invest money in that. Just gonna pop out here. Transformative programs, that was what we were talking about earlier, those one-time investments. We have, you know, public safety, broadband, transit, housing in neighborhoods. Like I said, this is one of the highest selected and commented on areas. People are very clear that affordable housing is a huge issue. And then we also have just the restoration of revenues. And we do have these little info boxes where we kind of explain that, these are lost revenues. People, I think, are still having a hard time kind of understanding what that really means, because it's also complicated for us, right? We're still trying to understand what revenues are coming in, what are lost, what those long-term implications are too. So that is more for people to understand that these are the areas that we did see an impact from COVID on the revenue side, particularly for us around Coliseum. Our Coliseum couldn't do events. We had a brand new performing arts center that was supposed to open the day of the shutdown in North Carolina. So, that was really sad. But, we have Hamilton coming in a couple of months. So, there's a lot of changes that have happened, and we will be making some of that back. But the reality is we have a whole year of revenue lost it completely in those areas. So that's also an awareness thing and an education piece for our residents. And then furthermore, we also just have your suggestions and ideas. And I'll tell you what, those are a hoot, guys. I recommend that because people give you great impact or great feedback, but you also get some gems. Like, you can just send it to me. I'll take care of that 59 million, so there's, but there's also some very good ideas in there. Just something like, have we thought about bus shelters? Are these a thing? And then, for us to go, okay, can we vet that? Does that apply within the interim final rule? Because, we know that that's not finalized yet. We have very good ideas of how to connect these to COVID, but we have to really be thoughtful about that entire process. And then over here, you can't change the revenue in a regular budget simulator. You would be able to, but this is just to let them know. And then they submit it. And what is cool about that is then we have a lot of data. We've had, like I said, over 500 submissions, and to Melissa's point also about age and the demographics of engagement, people under the age of 50 are engaging online, like at high levels. And I'm looking here, 65% of our respondents are under the age of 50, and over 53% are women. So we're seeing, very high engagement among demographics that are younger and more diverse. We even have non-binary and transgender respondents, which we, not always used that high spectrum of visibility for gender identity, but we're seeing a lot more diversity in that as well. So that's also telling for us what community groups, what age groups are engaging with us. So now I feel like I've talked a lot. I'm going to stop and pause there and see if anybody had any thoughts.
Yeah, and actually, I want to invite people, if you have questions, to put them in chat, and maybe Randy, John, and I can sort of find those. And John, I also want to invite you to throw in a thought-provoking question like you always do. But Sarah, I did want to mention that Greensboro. So I'd seen, kind of when the stimulus came out, there had been a decent number of surveys that went out. But surveys are sort of a particularly bad way of getting information on budget preferences. They don't do anything really on the 3 C's. They don't really provide, constraints, context, and really consequences. They ask for preferences without framing up trade-offs. So, kudos to Greensboro. And I know because of the timing of your budget and council interest and so forth, you guys went first. And I think it's a great effort. And I don't know if you know this or not, but you've already inspired 2 copycats. So Larimer County, Colorado, and I put this in the chat, has done almost exact same format as you. And then I just learned yesterday that Elk Grove, California did too. And I expect that there'll be more, because what you've done is just sort of a simple way of framing a conversation that's informed by the 3 C's. So that's fantastic. Melissa, what does this raise for you, and kind of the process that you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think this, loved everything Sarah had to say, and it sparked a couple of thoughts for me. One is I really like the link to the strategic plan, and Wauwatosa is in a bit of a unique place because our strategic plan ended in 2019, and we were due to launch a new strategic planning process in 2020. And that, of course, did not happen because we were all working on COVID response, and it was something that could be easily removed from our budget for last year. And so we have to go and talk with the community a little bit about themes and pressing issues, because we don't have that strategic plan to inform our directions. We're very hopeful that this engagement around the ARP funds is going to drive some thoughts about the development of our next strategic plan for this community. And so we will have real and fresh data to help us do that as part of this engagement process. But another thing, Chris, that you mentioned is how do we frame these conversations with our residents? And that's what I love to do more than anything else, is talk to people, but also kind of break down that government mystique. I think we have that habit of talking in acronyms and other things that just aren't understandable to the community. And so we are really helping our departments that have ideas and helping our residents who have ideas to really frame this in a way that any neighbor in this community can easily read and understand what we're talking about. And so, you know, as we talk about utility projects, I think there's a good way and a bad way to frame that. So, you know, one of the projects that our staff keeps talking about for ARP dollars is a pumping station, a secondary pumping station for one of our pressure zones that's served from one water source. And that's risky for many reasons. I'm sure everyone on this call understands that's less than ideal. But how do you explain that in a way that your public is going to understand why that matters? And how do you talk about what does this mean for me as a resident who lives in that pumping zone? What kind of things might damage that pipe? Why do I care if you know, what would that mean? A boil order? How long might it take to get water back up and running? And so really framing things in the way of residential impacts and helping people to understand what is a one-time cost, what are ongoing costs. These are words we throw around all the time that I'm not sure that everybody really recognizes as quickly. So how can you take a project and turn that into dollars and cents conversation? And so, you know, another great example here that we're talking about is expanding solar for some of our utilities. Well, that's a one-time project that we can fund as part of these dollars for our water utility that would take immediate funding out of our ongoing general budget every year. And so those are real numbers that we can say, like, here's money we can take for this purpose, and it's going to reduce your bill by, and it is going to reduce our costs by, and it is going to reduce debt by, because if we funded this project through debt financing, this is what this would look like. And so I think that really helps people to understand and engage more effectively. And that's what it is incumbent upon us to kind of do and drill down for them.
That's fantastic.
I saw a question here that that somebody
Yes.
popped up because I'm scanning the question.
Yeah.
So somebody had asked, and I think Melissa just answered quite beautifully, how you market or advertise this. I mean, this is really about boots on the ground. You know, right now we've done you know, press releases and social media posts, and you know, we've gone and talked to the news outlets and talked to the newspapers. Our next step is once we've pumped the brakes a little bit, you know, we've passed our budget, we're taking a breather for while we collect information, but we're going to be looking at doing pop-ups at farmers markets, doing pop-ups at the folk festival, which we have here in Greensboro, doing pop-ups at September Pride, like going to the community and having, you know, our input and having the information and trying to figure out a way to really connect with the community. So that'll be, you know, it'll be much more of a, it reminds me a lot of participatory budgeting for those of you that are familiar with that process. It'll be similar to that in the sense that we really need to make sure that we have many touch points, because not everybody's going to go online. Not everybody has access to online. Not everybody's going to watch a council meeting. You know, I know we all do, but most people don't, right? And then I saw that John had asked about the $59 million. Sounds like a lot of money. It does. A lot of people have asked for stimulus checks. That has been something that has come up. And whenever you take 300,000 people in Greensboro and you divide that by that amount, you're looking at $200 per person. It's really not a lot of money, you know, like it's not significant. And so, you know, managing those expectations will be a part of that outreach process. That's kind of the connection I'm trying to draw here. We have to help people understand what it can be spent on, what the constraints are, but also what we're already doing. You know, there are a lot of things. We have a $620 million budget, and we're doing a lot with that. So, you know, our day-to-day operations are as important as this amount of money. And we also need to be more transparent and clear about what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and help them to understand how those two things interact with each other, and how this is really that transformational money Whereas like our normal budget is just as valid and important and is passed on a yearly basis. So that's also a component. We really want to we hope this feeds to our engagement process with the budget and helps people to become more interested in it as an overall process.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly comment on that same question about how do you market this. What I found, kind of the major thing that makes people want to participate is if it matters. And so that's why the stimulus funding, because it's so clear that there's this new pot of money that hasn't been allocated. I mean, there's more than one use for every single one of those dollars, but it hasn't been allocated yet. The opportunity for their input to matter. And in particular, if it's conveyed by a top authority, whether it's a city manager or even ideally an elected official, who, like I showed you that slide that had a mayor, an elected county executive, and another mayor. If elected officials are saying, we have an opportunity here, or we've got a problem here, and I need your informed input, I found that people show up. And I've also found that the media will help. Because there's often not a good budget story or a constructive budget story. It's usually one that is, sort of so high level that people just sort of gloss over it and it doesn't even sink in. It's like, okay, there was 30 seconds on the news, didn't really matter. But what we found is that when you as a local government try to frame up a conversation, provide some accessibility to some of these trade-offs, that the media will be your partner in getting this out. And I could have shown you a picture of Mayor Peduto from Pittsburgh on the local CBS affiliate going, or the city manager of Lynchburg, Virginia, completely different market, also asking the same thing. And they get thousands and thousands of users just on their general budget. So Melissa, sorry, I think you're about to say something.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, totally agree. The media is your partner on this. We haven't even started our public engagement process because we're in the phase of hiring a consultant. We've had a ton of coverage in the local media. We have a lot of residents that have reached out with interest in getting involved. And so, we're building up that database. And I think that's an important thing that I would just pro tip for everyone is spread the word with your staff, because every department is probably getting calls and questions about this money. And they should be keeping a list, the city should, who is engaging with you, who's talking to you, who's reaching out, and what's their email address, and who are they? Because those are all people for you to push your online engagement tools out to, invitations to where you're going to be to talk with folks. And so there's a lot of ways to kind of build that up with somebody who's calling public works and somebody who's calling the city manager's office and somebody who's calling the school district. Those are all people you want to talk to.
That's great. I've got a question from Grace Johnson, and she asks, how do you determine which ideas from your suggestions and ideas are viable? What factors will determine which projects move forward?
That's a great question. As far as viability, I hate to say it this way, but that's all me. At this point in the process, that is literally me going through the comments and, seeing if it is just a comment like, hi, give me $2,000 or stimulus checks or reduced taxes. We know that some of those things are either not, super supported, but then we also know that some of those things are, just not eligible. We can't reduce the tax rate using this money. And so I do go through and vet those. And then if there are ideas that are possible, or they just reference something that I feel that management needs to at least know a comment has been made, then I include that in my report that I put together, which I use Power BI to use the report. So the cool thing is about this tool is that I can just pull down a great CSV file, clean up the data, and then I can make some really cool visuals. But I also do have to pull those comments out, and I do have to make decisions about how many comments I have related to housing, which one demonstrates what these 10 people said the best way. And, because you'll see similar comments, you'll see that they're talking about the same things, and then I, of course, if I was asked for the raw data, I would give that to the council to scrub, but most people don't want to have to go through that. So it's a combination of me making the decision about what I know is viable or not, and then also making sure that I am not leaving out things that are possible to do, but also that they need to know people are talking about. So even if it's not a part of the ARP conversation, maybe they need to know that, 15 people said, I feel like our bond money didn't go to the right place. So, just making sure that I'm getting that input that's been given to me to the right hands to make decisions or to inform them about what the public's giving us through this tool. And then factors about moving projects forward, that's going to really be incumbent upon the council and the city manager's office. So at some point when they're ready to start really going through the comments and the feedback, and then also this will be a hybrid approach with the needs of the staff. They have been presented with the things that everybody needs. I wouldn't call it a wish list because most of it is a need list. Most people have some pretty clear needs as a result of the pandemic. And so those will all be considered by the council and the city management in order to make those decisions.
Yeah.
And as cities kind of go through that process of vetting those public ideas, even vetting your staff's ideas, because I know our teams sometimes have ideas that aren't the best fit or not applicable for the funds, but would really encourage everyone to think about how is this an opportunity for government transparency and action. So Sarah was talking a lot about, and I loved this, where she's allocating her affinity groups for reports. And so public engagement summaries should be posted up on your website. If there's projects that are submitted that are not eligible uses, you should categorize those so people can see that these came in and this isn't eligible and this is why. And so people can see, oh gosh, look, the city got 2,000 comments about housing and that's a top priority. And that's why that's a top priority. And they got suggestions to hire 3 police officers and this is how they've responded to that. And so that we can really engage very transparently with our community about what decisions are being made based on what feedback and what outcomes are being driven from that.
Yeah, but isn't really this just going back to that broader idea, Melissa, that you sort of echoed, that this is, it's really about professional staff framing the conversation. And so viability is kind of framing. It's like, we really can't just put lemonade in all the fountains, around town, or, it's just not a good idea. But we could think about doing, there's about 500 other things we can do, but that's where, a professional administrator has a role, but then and sort of just have that two-way conversation. Quickly, I want to show you just a different type of engagement that I think might be useful for some. This was not available when Greensboro did theirs, but I think it might have some attractiveness to certain types of local governments in certain types of circumstances. Let me just show you quickly here. This is a brand new tool and it's called Prioritize. And it's meant to be much simpler than a simulation, but the idea is that you can sort of select items that you'd like to include within a certain amount of money, and each item has a price tag attached to it. So in this case, it's a county ARP fund demo, and over here the budget is $10 million, and then it's got a variety of things that could be done with that $10 million. But they also have price tags attached and descriptions. And so in this case, it's build sidewalks, and it's like, okay, some streets don't have sidewalks. And then they say, this is especially true in low-income neighborhoods. So it's got an equity component to it. So you can say, okay, I think that's something we should do. Or you could say, you know what, I think we should expand broadband. There seems to be a lot of interest in that. So, okay, I understand what that is. So let's go ahead and do it. Bridge repair, it's not grabbing me really right now, but you know what, installing solar, that really grabs me. And then I think I'd also like to improve accessibility, because that's important for all of our community members to be able to participate. And then I'd also, I've got a little bit of money left over, so I think I'd like to put in road resurfacing. But then, what's really important here is I want to do this solar, because I think that's really transformational. And then you can submit it, and then you can reorder things if you want to. And then I'm going to just show you what the back end looks like quickly here, but I need to pick the parking meters. And then I'm going to submit. And then it shows what I just did. But then on the back end, because I did this rank ordering, and in addition to selecting items to include up to $10 million, it gives me 2 types of scores. So it gives me weighted scores and unweighted scores. So the weighted takes into account the priorities. And so when you take the weighted scores into priority, the order is new playground, broadband, sidewalks, resurfacing. If you look at unweighted, it's broadband, resurfacing, sidewalks, playground. And then over here, you can actually select projects you want, and then it shows you, if I made these selections, that would mean that 35 voters would see at least one of their choices win. 62% would see 2, and 22% would see at least 3. And so I can kind of continue. So you kind of just see, would this sort of satisfy a lot of people's needs? So this is a new tool that is going to become available in about a week or so here. And it's, like I said, it's meant to be really simple. The whole tool took about, it took about half an hour to make that sample. And Sarah knows that simulations can be fairly complex and they require a little bit more work. But for just kind of a down and dirty, maybe we're getting, 22,000 or 22 million in stimulus money, and we kind of have a good idea of how we want to spend, 12 of it, but there's 10 million that we really would like to have some community input on. We've got a long list of things. That's the type of purpose that this tool could be used for.
Hey, Chris, I saw a question come in here real quick, and I think it's a really good way to throw a bow on this. And I'm curious also from Melissa's perspective. The guidance is changing. And we had a couple people ask about the guidance and how that's constantly evolving and how we're dealing with that.
Yeah.
So, to your point about you can throw this together kind of down and dirty, you can get it out there, right? Like, and that's what's cool about this particular tool is it's easy to do, but you do have to be prepared to pivot. And that is part of why the very beginning, we use these broad categories and why we kept the comments open. Because, and then, to that point of like, when you're parsing out things that are viable, eligible, not eligible, if they become eligible, you still have that data. You still know that, so say they come back and they say, well, 25% of it could be used to reduce your tax rate. Well, I've got 1,500 people over here who said they wanted to reduce their tax rate. Now that's very relevant information. So if for anybody who's doing any kind of outreach, whether you use a simulator, you use an info sheet or an ideation, strategy, I would recommend staying as high level as possible until we have more specific, until we have the final rule instead of the interim final rule, because that's been very helpful to us to pivot quickly as guidance changes. So for example, the police, the violent crime changes that weren't really changes, but they were more direct guidance. Our program was public safety programs. So people prioritized public safety programs, and there were some specifics, but now we know how much they're prioritizing that area. And so if we wanted to include something that was eligible based on the guidance that was issued yesterday, we have that data to support that type of endeavor.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. Anybody have any questions or comments? Otherwise, I've got a little bit more. Let me ask this question. Some people might say, we're not going to really learn anything from the public, or, why wouldn't we just consult experts? Or, the city employs experts. If we're looking at, ideas to reduce crime, well, we have a police chief, and, that police chief has experience and, is probably a pretty, is a great expert on this. What is the value of getting community input on all this? And why are you going to, it's a lot of trouble. Why are you bothering? And Melissa, maybe ask you first.
Well, I hear this a lot. I hear this commentary a lot. And I would say that we as public servants have an obligation to talk and engage with our community about what they want from their community. So when things are going great and things are going well, they're not thinking about those services that we provide, right? Because they're driving down their road on the way to work, their garbage is picked up, their tap is turning on, the water's clean, their roads are plowed up here,
right?
Crime is low, all of those things. But that doesn't mean that we fully understand what their vision is and what they're looking for. And this is their community that we have the pleasure of helping them to serve. And so I would say, yes, we have subject matter experts that can help bring that vision to reality, but we have an obligation to talk with our community, to understand their vision, their values, and help them bring that to reality. And so I think don't miss that here with this amount of money.
Sarah?
Beautifully said. I have nothing to add to that. We share the exact same sentiment.
And I'll just add that back in when I used to do a lot more public policy facilitation, my definition of a good conversation was one that you didn't know the outcome of before you started. And if you can frame up the right kind of a conversation with the public you'll be surprised. As Sarah pointed out, sometimes you're surprised in funny ways, but you might be surprised with some real wisdom and some just incisive ideas that could be incredibly valuable for the entire community moving forward. So last comments from Sarah and Melissa, and then maybe see if John and Brandy have anything before we close out.
The only thing I have to add is that I just appreciate the opportunity to reach out to everybody. And I do want to invite anyone who has questions or just wants to talk something out, or also have ideas for me. You know, nobody's an expert at this, right? You know, we're all learning as we muddle through. So I invite you to reach out to me we'll drop emails wherever. And I would love to have more conversations with different municipalities and just learn from each other. So I would just like to invite that collaborative opportunity.
Great.
I will second that. Beautifully said, Sarah. And I would love to hear from anyone about your innovation, your public engagement, what's working, what's not working. I think we'll learn through this together and lead together.
That's great. Thank you both. It's been so inspiring to get a chance to get to know you all on this issue, and I'm looking forward to hearing about how it goes and how it helps your community. So, John and Brandy.
John, anything before I close this out?
I'll just say that I was lucky to be part of the planning call, but this exceeded even those expectations. You guys did such a great job, and we appreciate your being vulnerable to share something that you're working on right now. We don't know the end of this story, and we just appreciate you're willing to try and share. And I'd encourage all of you, that's how we learn, sharing with each other. So if you're doing great things, let the Alliance know. We'll get this information out. I think there was one thing that I took from this that's so important when you were both talking about, this is not about just fixing the bricks and mortar and concrete. This is about investing in our future. This is about using foresight to anticipate what do we need to do. And one of the things that I've been talking to a lot of communities about, Chris has got his 3 C's, I've got my 3 R's, that we use this money to help us reopen, revitalize, and reimagine. That if we focus on those 3 things, and I think, Sarah, it hits every one of your buckets. That's what you're talking about. We're reopening our communities, we're revitalizing them, trying to figure out what we can do to help people, but we're reimagining what the future looks like. So I just am so impressed and so thrilled, and I want to hear your stories as they unfold. So we'll have to do another webinar to find out, so what happened? What's the rest of this story? I'll play Paul Harvey.
Let's find the rest of the story. Thank you so much, everyone, to our panel today. Thank you, Chris, for leading the discussion. John, I love it. As we figure this out together, I put my contact information in the chat box. If you need help reaching out to Sarah or Melissa, we're happy to do that. Stay tuned for this webinar part 2, how it all went. We'll be back in touch soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Goodbye.